Hello everyone, I am the boring historian, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. In the shadowed cloisters of medieval Europe, behind stone walls and iron gates designed to separate holy women from worldly temptation, a complex drama of human desire played out against the backdrop of religious devotion. The medieval convent, ostensibly a sanctuary of prayer, chastity, and spiritual contemplation, harbored within its walls the full spectrum of human experience, including the forbidden yearnings of the flesh that the Church sought so desperately to suppress. The story of medieval nuns and their carnal transgressions represents one of history's most fascinating tensions: the struggle between institutional religious ideals and the persistent realities of human nature. These women, who had taken solemn vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, found themselves caught between the spiritual aspirations of their calling and the biological and emotional imperatives of their humanity. Their stories reveal not only the personal struggles of individuals, but also illuminate broader patterns of gender, power, and sexuality in medieval society. This examination of the sexual scandals that periodically rocked medieval convents is not an exercise in salacious gossip or an attempt to undermine the genuine spiritual commitment of the vast majority of religious women throughout the Middle Ages. Rather, it is an opportunity to consider the full humanity of these women, who have too often been flattened into stereotypes, either as paragons of piety or as hypocrites whose behavior made a mockery of their vows. The truth, as always, lies in the nuanced middle ground where real human beings navigated complicated lives within the constraints of their time. The monastic movement within Christianity began in the deserts of Egypt and Syria in the 3rd and 4th centuries, as devout men and women sought to escape worldly corruption and dedicate themselves entirely to God. For women, monasticism offered something particularly valuable: an alternative to marriage and childbearing, the only other respectable options available to them in medieval society. By the early Middle Ages, female monasticism had become firmly established across Europe, with convents serving as centers of learning, prayer, and female community. The spiritual ideal that guided these communities was one of complete dedication to God, with chastity viewed as a fundamental requirement. Virginity was exalted as the highest state for women, following the example of the Virgin Mary and early female martyrs, who had died protecting their sexual purity. As one 12th century theologian wrote, "The Virgin Bride of Christ transcends the bounds of human nature, and through her purity, she approaches the nature of angels." This ideology of sacred virginity was powerful and pervasive, but it existed in tension with the practical realities of convent life. The women who entered convents were not angels but human beings, bringing with them all the desires, passions, and weaknesses inherent to humanity. Moreover, despite the ideal of complete separation from the world, convents remained embedded in medieval society, maintaining necessary connections with secular and ecclesiastical authorities, managing property, and interacting with the communities around them. To understand the nature of sexual scandals in medieval convents, we must first understand who these women were and why they had taken the veil. The popular image of the medieval nun as a woman driven solely by religious fervor offers only a partial truth. While some women certainly entered convents out of genuine spiritual calling, many others became nuns for complex reasons that had little to do with religious vocation. Noble and wealthy families frequently placed excess daughters in convents when suitable marriages could not be arranged, or when dowry funds were insufficient. Some women entered convents to escape unwanted marriages or to find refuge after being widowed. Others were placed in convents as children, having no say in their future lives. By the later Middle Ages, many convents functioned essentially as aristocratic enclaves, where women of good birth could live comfortable lives while maintaining their social status. The 13th century canonist Hostiensis acknowledged this reality when he wrote that many enter monasteries not for the sake of a simple life and purity, but for the sake of abundance and to satisfy their greed or lust. While this assessment was undoubtedly cynical, it contained a kernel of truth that helps explain why some nuns might have struggled to maintain their vows of chastity. A woman who had entered a convent reluctantly, under family pressure or economic necessity, might find the demands of perpetual celibacy particularly difficult to bear. Central to the Church's strategy for maintaining female chastity was the practice of enclosure, physically segregating nuns from the outside world, and particularly from men. The rules governing female monastic communities emphasized strict enclosure as essential for preserving both the actual chastity of nuns and the appearance of propriety. As one episcopal directive from 1238 stated, "We strictly forbid any man to enter the cloister of the nuns after the bell has been rung for compline, and if any man shall do this, let him be excommunicated." In theory, these regulations created an impenetrable barrier between nuns and potential sexual partners. In practice, however, maintaining strict enclosure proved nearly impossible. Convents required the services of priests to perform the sacraments, particularly Mass and confession. They needed lay workers to perform heavy labor and specialized tasks. They received visitors, including family members of the nuns. Many convents maintained economic enterprises that necessitated interaction with the outside world. Moreover, the physical infrastructure of many convents was inadequate to maintain strict enclosure. In 1298, Pope Boniface VIII issued the decree Periculoso, which mandated universal strict enclosure for all professed nuns. But this ideal was rarely achieved in practice. Bishops' visitation records are filled with complaints about broken walls, unlocked doors, and other breaches in the physical barriers meant to separate nuns from the world. A visitation report from the Diocese of Lincoln in 1440 noted that at St. Michael's Convent, the enclosure walls of the priory are broken down in many places, so that strangers and animals can enter at will. These practical challenges to maintaining enclosure created opportunities for illicit encounters, setting the stage for the sexual scandals that periodically emerged from medieval convents. One of the most problematic institutional arrangements from the perspective of preventing sexual misconduct was the double monastery, a religious house containing both male and female communities under a single leadership. These institutions emerged early in Christian monasticism, with examples dating back to the 4th century in Egypt and Syria. By the early Middle Ages, double monasteries had spread throughout Europe, providing a solution to the practical problem of providing sacramental ministry to enclosed women. Double monasteries typically featured separate living quarters for monks and nuns, sometimes divided by a river, wall, or significant distance. However, the communities would share a church with architectural features designed to prevent visual contact between the sexes during worship. The male community would provide spiritual services to the female community, while the female community might provide domestic services such as laundering vestments or preparing food. From their inception, double monasteries generated anxiety about sexual impropriety. The 6th century Byzantine Emperor Justinian prohibited the formation of new double monasteries in his empire, ordering that existing communities strictly separate men and women. The Second Council of Nicaea in 787 echoed these concerns, declaring that double monasteries had become an offense and cause of complaint to many, and prohibiting monks and nuns from residing in the same building. Bookmark U90N1M2. The Gilbertine Scandal at Wotton. Perhaps the most notorious scandal involving a double monastery occurred in the 12th century Gilbertine Order of England. Founded by Gilbert of Sempringham, the Gilbertines organized their houses with 4 sub-communities: 2 for women, nuns and lay sisters, and 2 for men, canons and lay brothers. Though Gilbert had established elaborate precautions to prevent inappropriate contact between the sexes, these measures ultimately proved insufficient. Around 1160, a shocking incident occurred at the Gilbertine Priory of Wotton in Yorkshire. According to the account written by the Cistercian abbot Aelred of Rievaulx, a young nun, who had been placed in the convent as a child against her will, began a sexual relationship with one of the lay brothers. When her pregnancy revealed the affair, the other nuns captured her lover and forced the pregnant nun to castrate him. The nuns then reportedly shoved the severed testicles into her mouth, a punishment of grotesque symbolism that reflected the perceived severity of their transgression. This horrific episode prompted an investigation by Pope Alexander III into the proximity of men and women in Gilbertine houses. The order responded by implementing even stricter segregation between its male and female members. 5 bishops wrote to Alexander to assure him that men and women were now strictly segregated in the Gilbertine communities within their dioceses. The incident at Wotton revealed both the potential for sexual misconduct in double monasteries and the extreme reactions such transgressions could provoke. The Wotton scandal was not unique. Throughout the Middle Ages, ecclesiastical authorities struggled to regulate contact between religious men and women in double monasteries and other mixed communities. The regulations grew increasingly elaborate as authorities attempted to close every possible avenue for inappropriate interaction. In some communities, even brothers and sisters or mothers and sons had to obtain special permission to meet face to face. The 12th century monk Irembert of Admont claimed that the women in his community were locked within an enclosure secured with a 3-lock door, which was only open to admit a new woman to the community, for a priest to administer last rites, or to remove a nun's body for burial. Physical barriers such as grills, screens, and curtains were installed in churches and visiting areas to prevent visual contact between the sexes. Despite these precautions, the very existence of double monasteries created opportunities for sexual misconduct that single-sex institutions could more easily avoid. By the late Middle Ages, most double monasteries had either been dissolved or transformed into single-sex communities, though the problem of providing sacramental ministry to enclosed women remained. Among the most common and problematic forms of sexual misconduct in medieval convents were relationships between nuns and the priests who served as their confessors and spiritual directors. These relationships were particularly troubling to ecclesiastical authorities because they represented not just a breach of celibacy vows, but also an abuse of spiritual power and trust. The sacrament of confession created a unique space of intimate disclosure between a nun and her confessor. The confessor gained knowledge of a nun's innermost thoughts, including her sexual temptations and desires. This spiritual intimacy could sometimes develop into emotional and eventually physical intimacy. The 13th century theologian Thomas Aquinas specifically warned against this danger, writing that the devil often deceives both penitent and confessor under the appearance of good, leading them step by step toward ruin. Visitation records from bishops across Europe document numerous cases of inappropriate relationships between nuns and their confessors. In 1314, Bishop Woodiford of Winchester discovered that the prioress of Romsey Abbey had given birth to a child fathered by her chaplain. In 1336, an investigation at the Cistercian nunnery of Hampole revealed that Sir John de Medley, the house's chaplain, had fathered a child with one of the nuns. The recurring nature of such cases led to increasing restrictions on the interactions between nuns and their confessors, with confession often taking place through a grille or screen that prevented physical contact. While relationships with priests presented particular spiritual dangers, relationships between nuns and laymen were more common. Despite regulations restricting visitors to convents, lay workers, tradesmen, and relatives of the nuns regularly entered convent grounds, creating opportunities for illicit encounters. In some regions, particularly in Italy, young men known as monachini, literally little monks, became notorious for frequenting areas near convents or visiting them openly, becoming the lovers of willing nuns. In Florence, the practice became so common that it spawned a genre of erotic literature centered on convent seductions. While such literature undoubtedly exaggerated the prevalence of such relationships for titillation, it reflected a real social phenomenon. Bishops' registers document numerous cases of nuns engaging in relationships with laymen. In 1318, Archbishop William Melton of York recorded that Alice de Lacy, a nun of Arthington Priory, had lapsed into incontinence with John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey. A particularly scandalous case, given the high social status of both parties. In 1434, Bishop Grey of Lincoln discovered that Agnes Bowes of Markyate Priory had left the convent multiple times to meet with a man named John Vale, with whom she had engaged in incontinence. Perhaps the least documented but nonetheless real form of sexual misconduct in medieval convents involved relationships between nuns themselves. While medieval society lacked modern concepts of sexual orientation and identity, records indicate awareness of same-sex desire and behavior among women in convents. Ecclesiastical authorities were concerned about excessive intimacy between nuns, which they feared could lead to unnatural vice. The rule of St. Benedict specifically prohibited nuns from sleeping two to a bed, and convent regulations often forbade nuns from entering each other's cells or dormitories. Visitation records occasionally contain veiled references to suspicious relationships between nuns, though explicit accusations of sexual misconduct were rare. In 1372, Archbishop Sudbury of Canterbury reprimanded the prioress of Wintney for allowing certain of the nuns to hold suspicious conversations together in private chambers. In 1440, Bishop Alnwick of Lincoln noted during a visitation that Dame Juliana Dilly and Dame Catherine Michelson of Legbourne Priory sleep together in the same bed, contrary to the rule, though he did not explicitly accuse them of sexual misconduct. The reticence of medieval sources regarding same-sex relationships makes it difficult to determine their prevalence in convents. However, the consistent concern about excessive intimacy between nuns suggests that ecclesiastical authorities recognized the possibility of such relationships and sought to prevent them. One of the most notorious scandals of the early medieval period involved the Royal Merovingian Nunnery of Sainte-Croix in Poitiers, France. Founded in the 6th century by the Frankish queen Saint Radegund, this prestigious convent became the site of a shocking rebellion led by two royal nuns in the year 589. Clothilde and Basina, both princesses of the Merovingian royal house, had been placed in the convent for political reasons rather than out of personal devotion. When a new abbess was appointed whom they disliked, they led approximately 40 nuns in a violent revolt, breaking the cloister and seeking protection from their royal relatives. According to the contemporary account by Bishop Gregory of Tours, the rebellious nuns abandoned their rule and their vows of chastity during this period of rebellion. Gregory's History of the Franks describes how the rebellious nuns took up residence in the Basilica of St. Hilary, where they entertained men of dubious reputation and engaged in shameful behavior unworthy of their vocation. When church authorities attempted to intervene, the rebellious nuns physically attacked the bishop's representatives. The scandal was so severe that a church council was convened to address it, ultimately forcing the rebellious nuns to return to their convent under threat of excommunication. The St. Croix scandal illustrates several important patterns in medieval convent scandals. First, it demonstrates how women placed in convents against their will might rebel against the restrictions of monastic life. Second, it shows how high social status could provide nuns with the connections and resources to defy ecclesiastical authority. Finally, it reveals how sexual misconduct often occurred in the context of broader disciplinary breakdowns, rather than as isolated moral failings. One of the most thoroughly documented convent scandals occurred much later, in the 19th century, but illustrates patterns that were likely present throughout the medieval period as well. In 1859, Princess Katharina von Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen fled the convent of San Ambrogio in Rome and reported serious abuses to the Vatican's Inquisition, triggering a detailed investigation. The investigation revealed that the convent's novice mistress, Maria Luisa, had engaged in sexual relationships with multiple nuns, including novices under her spiritual authority. She had justified these relationships by claiming they were divinely sanctioned, part of a mystical practice that would bring the participants closer to God. The charismatic Maria Luisa had manipulated vulnerable young nuns by exploiting their religious devotion and spiritual aspirations. While this case occurred long after the medieval period, it sheds light on dynamics that were likely present in medieval convents as well. The use of religious justifications for sexual behavior, the exploitation of power differentials within convent hierarchies, and the manipulation of spiritual devotion to enable sexual abuse all represent patterns that transcend historical periods. Medieval visitation records contain hints of similar dynamics, though rarely with the detailed documentation available in the Sant Ambrogio case. The case of Catherine Wells, prioress of Littlemore Priory near Oxford in the early 16th century, provides a well-documented example of persistent sexual misconduct by a convent leader. Bishop Atwater's visitation in 1517 revealed that the prioress had given birth to multiple children fathered by a chaplain named Richard Hughes. Moreover, she had used the convent's resources to provide for her children, selling the priory's woods, pawning its jewelry, and even selling its sacred vessels. The report stated that the prioress had given birth to children and given the goods of the house to her children, and that she consorts and drinks with Richard Hughes day and night. The scandal extended beyond the prioress herself. The visitation also found that one of the nuns had given birth to a child fathered by a married man from Oxford, while another had run away with stolen goods from the priory. The Littlemore case illustrates several important patterns in medieval convent scandals. First, it demonstrates how the misconduct of a convent's leader could undermine discipline throughout the community. Second, it shows the connection between sexual misconduct and financial mismanagement, as resources meant for the convent were diverted to support the prioress's children. Finally, It reveals the complexity of relationships between religious women and the men in their lives, which often endured over many years despite ecclesiastical prohibitions. For a nun engaged in a sexual relationship, pregnancy represented the most visible and undeniable evidence of her transgression. Unlike other forms of sexual misconduct, which might remain hidden or be known only through rumor, pregnancy created physical evidence that could not be easily concealed within the close quarters of a convent. As one medieval proverb bluntly stated, "The belly cannot be hidden." When a nun became pregnant, the convent community faced a crisis that threatened not only the spiritual standing of the individual woman, but also the reputation of the entire community. Ecclesiastical authorities viewed pregnancy among nuns with particular gravity because it combined the sin of breaking the vow of chastity with the public scandal that undermined the church's moral authority. As a result, pregnant nuns faced severe consequences, though the specific response varied widely depending on the time period, the region, and the particular circumstances of the case. Historical records reveal a range of responses to nuns who became pregnant. In some cases, the pregnant nun was immediately expelled from her community and forced to return to her family or make her own way in the world. A particularly harsh punishment in a society that offered few respectable options for unmarried women, especially those who had broken religious vows. An entry in the register of Archbishop Greenfield of York from 1308 records that Alice de Regat, a nun of Yettingham, was to be expelled from the community after becoming pregnant. In other cases, pregnant nuns were permitted to remain within the convent, but subjected to severe penances. These might include public confession of their sin before the community, relegation to the lowest position in the convent hierarchy, restrictive diet, physical discipline, and confinement to a prison cell within the convent grounds. The 13th century canonist Hostiensis recommended that a nun who had fallen into the vice of the flesh should be enclosed within the narrowest of cells, there to perform perpetual penance on bread and water. Some convents developed more compassionate approaches, particularly in later centuries. A pregnant nun might be sent temporarily to a rural property owned by the convent, or to stay with relatives until she had given birth, and arrangements had been made for the child. She might then be permitted to return to her community after completing appropriate penances. A 15th century entry in the register of the Bishop of Lincoln notes that Dame Emma Porter of Elstow Abbey, who had become pregnant, was to be sent to the convent's grange at Kempston until her time comes, after which she may return to the monastery having completed suitable penance. The fate of children born to nuns represents one of the most poignant aspects of medieval convent scandals. These innocent products of forbidden relationships faced uncertain futures in a society that stigmatized illegitimacy, while simultaneously recognizing that children should not be punished for the sins of their parents. Some children born to nuns were raised by the father's family, particularly if the father was a man of means. A few wealthier nuns managed to provide dowries for daughters or education for sons using their family resources, though this typically required the cooperation of relatives outside the convent. In one extraordinary case from the early 16th century, records indicate that a prioress sold convent goods to provide for her children, though this was clearly viewed as a serious abuse of her position. Many children, however, were abandoned to foundling homes or handed over to peasant families as foster children. Infant mortality in such circumstances was extremely high. Those who survived might grow up never knowing their true parentage, or might be told only later in life. Despite the stigma of illegitimacy, Surviving records indicate that some children of nuns managed to lead relatively normal lives, particularly if they had the support of extended family networks. Ecclesiastical law technically barred illegitimate sons from ordination without a special dispensation, a rule that particularly affected the sons of clergy and nuns. However, such dispensations were frequently granted, especially if the young man demonstrated suitable piety and learning. The papal registers contain numerous examples of dispensations granted to the son of a nun and an unmarried man, or similar descriptions, allowing these young men to pursue ecclesiastical careers despite the circumstances of their birth. The primary mechanism for identifying and addressing sexual misconduct in medieval convents was the episcopal visitation, a formal inspection conducted by the bishop of the diocese or his representatives. During these visitations, which ideally occurred every 3 years, though in practice often happened less frequently, the bishop would interview each nun individually and in confidence, allowing her to report any problems or abuses within the community. The records of these visitations, preserved in bishops' registers across Europe, provide our most detailed window into the day-to-day realities of convent life, including sexual transgressions. The process typically began with the bishop reading out a list of questions or articles of inquiry, covering all aspects of convent life, from the state of the buildings to the moral conduct of the community members. Each nun would then be questioned privately about what she had seen or heard regarding these matters. This system created a formal channel for reporting misconduct, but it had significant limitations. Nuns might hesitate to report their sisters or superiors out of loyalty, fear of retaliation, or concern for the reputation of their community. Bishops varied greatly in their diligence and in their willingness to address problems once identified. The infrequency of visitations meant that misconduct might continue for years before being addressed. Nevertheless, the visitation system provided at least some accountability and oversight for communities that might otherwise have operated with little external scrutiny. When sexual misconduct was discovered, medieval church law provided a range of punishments, depending on the severity of the offense and the status of the individuals involved. For nuns who had broken their vow of chastity, canon law prescribed punishments that were both punitive and remedial, aimed at both deterring others and reforming the sinner. The most severe punishment was excommunication and permanent expulsion from the religious community, a penalty typically reserved for nuns who had engaged in persistent misconduct or who had fled the convent with a lover. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 declared that nuns who have fallen into the sin of the flesh and who had not repented after appropriate warnings should be cast out of their monasteries without hope of return. More commonly, nuns found guilty of sexual misconduct faced temporary exclusion from community life, confinement within a prison cell in the convent, physical discipline such as flogging, and various forms of public penance. A typical sentence might require the offending nun to fast on bread and water for specified days, to recite additional prayers or psalms, to eat separately from the community seated on the floor, and to occupy the lowest place in processions and the choir. The severity of these punishments reflected the seriousness with which the medieval church viewed violations of religious vows. However, historical records indicate that in practice, many communities took a more moderate approach, particularly for first offenses or cases involving mitigating circumstances. After the appropriate penance had been completed, many nuns were fully reintegrated into their communities. Throughout the Middle Ages, periodic reform movements sought to address perceived moral laxity in religious communities. including sexual misconduct in convents. These reform efforts typically focused on reinforcing enclosure, strengthening supervision, and returning to the strict observance of monastic rules. The 13th century saw a significant reform movement associated with the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, which mandated regular visitations of all religious houses and established clearer procedures for addressing misconduct. In the 15th century, the Council of Constance, 1414–1418, and the Council of Basel, 1431–1449, initiated another wave of reforms focused on moral discipline in religious communities. These reform movements had mixed results. In some regions and orders, they succeeded in establishing stricter discipline and reducing reported cases of misconduct. The reforms associated with the Benedictine congregation of Santa Giustina in Italy, for example, effectively addressed moral laxity in many Italian convents. In other areas, particularly where convents had become essentially aristocratic institutions with little genuine religious vocation, reforms made little lasting impact. The most dramatic reform came with the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, which led to the dissolution of monasteries and convents in Protestant regions. In Catholic regions, the Counter-Reformation brought renewed emphasis on strict enclosure and moral discipline for female religious. The Council of Trent, 1545–1563, mandated universal strict enclosure for all professed nuns and established more rigorous procedures for selecting and training candidates for religious life, addressing many of the systemic issues that had contributed to sexual misconduct in medieval convents. To understand sexual transgressions in medieval convents, we must place them within the broader context of medieval attitudes towards sexuality and celibacy. Medieval Christian theology viewed sexual desire as a consequence of original sin, a potentially destructive force that needed to be strictly controlled. At the same time, medieval culture recognized sexual desire as a natural and universal human experience. This ambivalence is reflected in medieval medical theory, which viewed sexual abstinence as potentially harmful to physical health, particularly for young people. Medical authorities from Hippocrates to Avicenna had warned that prolonged sexual abstinence could lead to various illnesses, particularly for those with hot temperaments. Some medieval physicians even recommended masturbation as a medical treatment for conditions believed to result from sexual frustration, though religious authorities condemned this practice. Medieval theological writings often describe the struggle against sexual desire as one of the greatest spiritual challenges, especially for those who had taken vows of celibacy. Saint Jerome famously wrote of his battles with sexual temptation during his time as a desert hermit. Though I had no companions but scorpions and wild beasts, my mind was burning with desires and the fires of lust. The prevalence of such testimonies suggests a recognition that celibacy represented a difficult ideal rather than an easily achieved state. Given these cultural attitudes, medieval society may have viewed sexual transgressions by religious women with a complex mixture of condemnation and understanding. While breaking religious vows was considered a serious sin, there was also recognition of the difficulty of maintaining perpetual celibacy, particularly for those who had not freely chosen the religious life. A striking aspect of medieval responses to sexual misconduct in religious communities was the double standard applied to men and women. While both monks and nuns took identical vows of chastity, sexual transgressions by nuns typically provoked more severe condemnation and punishment than similar behavior by monks or priests. This double standard reflected broader societal attitudes toward male and female sexuality. Medieval medical and philosophical traditions drawing on ancient authorities like Aristotle and Galen, portrayed women as inherently more lustful and less rational than men. According to these traditions, women's cold and wet humoral nature made them more susceptible to sexual temptation and less capable of controlling their desires. As the 13th century philosopher Albertus Magnus wrote, "Woman is less capable than man of adhering to reason, and more quickly led by her passions." At the same time, the consequences of sexual activity were far more visible for women than for men to the possibility of pregnancy. A monk or priest who engaged in sexual activity might escape detection unless openly indiscreet, while a nun who became pregnant faced inevitable exposure. This biological reality contributed to the stricter supervision imposed on female religious communities compared to their male counterparts. Moreover, medieval society placed extraordinary value on female virginity, viewing it as a woman's most precious possession and the foundation of her honor. A nun who violated her vow of chastity not only committed a sin against God, but also lost the virginity that defined her sacred status. In contrast, while a monk who broke his vow committed an equally serious sin in theological terms, he did not suffer the same irreversible loss of status in the eyes of society. Throughout the Middle Ages, a significant gap existed between the theoretical ideals of female monasticism and the practical realities of convent life. This gap helps explain not only why sexual transgressions occurred, but also how communities responded to them. In theory, convents were supposed to admit only women with genuine religious vocations who freely chose to take vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. In practice, many convents became repositories for surplus daughters of the nobility, women seeking refuge from difficult circumstances, and girls placed there as children without any meaningful choice. The Benedictine rule specified a minimum age of 16 for taking final vows, but historical records show that this requirement was often ignored. Similarly, the ideal of strict enclosure, complete physical separation from the outside world, proved impossible to fully implement in practice. Convents needed to interact with the outside world to obtain essential goods and services, to manage their properties, and to fulfill various religious and social functions. Despite elaborate precautions, these necessary interactions created opportunities for inappropriate relationships to develop. Perhaps most importantly, the theoretical model of the convent as a community of spiritually minded women, devoted exclusively to prayer and contemplation, rarely matched the social reality. By the later Middle Ages, many convents functioned essentially as aristocratic enclaves where women of good birth could live comfortable lives while maintaining their social status. In such communities, strict adherence to all aspects of the monastic rule, including the vow of chastity, might receive less emphasis than social propriety and the maintenance of the community's reputation. This gap between theory and practice created a complex moral landscape in which sexual transgressions, while officially condemned, might be tacitly tolerated as long as they remained discreet and did not threaten the community's stability or reputation. As one 15th century abbess reportedly told her nuns, "Sin if you must, but do not cause scandal." The sexuality of nuns fascinated medieval popular culture, generating a rich body of stories, jokes, and songs that both reflected and shaped public perceptions of female religious communities. These cultural representations ranged from respectful acknowledgement of the challenges of celibacy to outright pornographic fantasies that bore little relation to reality. By the late Middle Ages, the figure of the lustful or hypocritical nun had become a stock character in popular literature across Europe. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, 1353, included multiple tales of nuns engaging in sexual adventures, most famously the story of Masetto de Lamperecchio, a young man who feigned muteness to gain employment as a gardener at a convent, where he eventually became the lover of all the nuns, including the abbess. Similar tales appeared in the anonymous Faceti of Poggio Bracciolini, the French Fabliaux, and various German story collections. These literary representations typically portrayed nuns as either naive victims of seduction or as sexually insatiable women who had entered convents for reasons other than religious devotion. Either way, they reinforced the notion that female celibacy was unnatural and ultimately unsustainable. As one medieval French proverb put it, "Put not your trust in the vows of a nun, for nature will have its way." Popular songs known as Goliardic verse, often attributed to wandering scholars and clerics, frequently included ribald references to nuns and their supposed sexual activities. The famous 13th century collection Carmina Burana contains several such songs, including one that begins, "If I were made abbot of a nunnery, I would satisfy 100 sisters daily." While these literary and musical representations undoubtedly exaggerated the prevalence of sexual misconduct in convents for comic or titillating effect, they reflected genuine public skepticism about the practicality and sustainability of female celibacy. They also suggest that despite the Church's efforts to portray nuns as spiritually elevated beings, removed from earthly desires, popular culture continued to view them as women subject to the same natural impulses as their secular counterparts. Medieval visual art presented a more complex and nuanced view of nuns than the often satirical literary representations. Illuminated manuscripts, church carvings, and paintings depicted nuns in various contexts, from idealized devotional images to more ambiguous scenes that hinted at human frailty. Official religious art typically portrayed nuns as models of piety and devotion, with downcast eyes, hands folded in prayer, and bodies completely concealed beneath voluminous habits. These images reinforced the ideal of the nun as a bride of Christ, focused exclusively on spiritual matters and removed from worldly concerns, including sexuality. However, marginalia in illuminated manuscripts sometimes told a different story. The margins of even religious texts might contain small illustrations of nuns in compromising positions or engaged in worldly activities. These marginal images served various purposes: comic relief, moral warnings, or simply acknowledgement of human nature. But they suggest an awareness of the gap between the ideal and reality of convent life. Church carvings and misericords, the underside of folding seats and choir stalls, occasionally included similar imagery. A famous misericord from Beverley Minster in England depicts a nun holding hands with a priest, while another from Manchester Cathedral shows a fox dressed as a bishop preaching to a congregation of geese, potential allegory for clerical seduction of naive nuns. These visual representations, like their literary counterparts, reveal medieval society's ambivalence toward female monasticism. While officially venerating the ideal of the chaste, devoted nun, popular culture maintained a degree of skepticism about the practical implementation of this ideal, recognizing the tensions between institutional religious expectations and human nature. When actual scandals involving nuns became public knowledge, they had a significant impact on public perception of female religious communities. While medieval society maintained a general respect for the religious life, specific scandals could undermine the reputation of particular convents, or even call into question the entire institution of female monasticism. Local communities often developed complex relationships with the convents in their midst. On one hand, convents provided valuable spiritual and social services, including prayers for the dead, education for girls, charity for the poor, and care for the sick. On the other hand, when scandals erupted, they could become objects of gossip, ridicule, or moral outrage. The impact of scandal varied widely depending on the specific circumstances and the broader social and political context. In some cases, a scandal involving a single nun might be quickly contained through appropriate discipline, with minimal damage to the convent's reputation. In other cases, particularly those involving convent leaders or multiple community members, scandals could lead to lasting stigma and even eventual closure of the institution. The most severe impact typically occurred when scandals reinforced existing criticisms of female monasticism or coincided with broader religious or political tensions. In the decades leading up to the Protestant Reformation, for example, reports of sexual misconduct in convents were seized upon by reformist critics as evidence of the corruption of the Catholic Church and the futility of enforced celibacy. Martin Luther, himself a former monk who later married a former nun, cited such scandals as evidence that the monastic vow of chastity contradicted natural law and divine intention. Even within Catholic regions, recurring scandals contributed to the increasingly strict regulation of female religious communities during the Counter-Reformation period. The Council of Trent's insistence on universal strict enclosure for all professed nuns reflected not only theological concerns, but also practical efforts to prevent the kinds of scandals that had damaged the Church's moral authority in previous centuries. To understand sexual transgressions in medieval convents, we must consider them not only as moral failings or lapses in discipline, but also as manifestations of complex power dynamics and forms of resistance. For many women in convents, particularly those placed there against their will, sexual relationships represented not just the satisfaction of physical desire, but also a form of agency and resistance against institutional control. Medieval convents were hierarchical institutions embedded within the broader patriarchal structures of the church and secular society. Nuns were subject to multiple layers of male authority, from the pope and bishops to the priests who served as their confessors and chaplains. Within this context, sexual relationships, while officially forbidden, could represent a reclaiming of bodily autonomy and a rejection of institutional control. This understanding helps explain why sexual misconduct in convents often coincided with other forms of rebellion or resistance. Records of visitations frequently note connections between sexual transgressions and other disciplinary problems, such as disobedience to superiors, rejection of communal poverty, or resistance to enclosure regulations. The 15th century theologian Jean Gerson observed that the nun who has abandoned her vow of chastity seldom maintains her other vows faithfully. Moreover, the choice of sexual partners often reflected power dynamics within and beyond the convent. Relationships with priests or confessors might give nuns access to privileges or protection, while relationships with powerful laymen could provide resources or potential escape from convent life. Even relationships between nuns of different ranks within the community might reflect or challenge existing power structures. Understanding medieval convent sexuality through this lens of power and resistance does not excuse or minimize the breach of religious vows that such relationships represented. However, it helps us recognize the complex motivations and contexts that shaped these transgressions, moving beyond simple narratives of moral failure or spiritual weakness. The psychological dynamics of medieval convent life created conditions that could either sublimate or intensify sexual desire, depending on individual personalities and circumstances. Modern psychological understanding suggests that the extreme emphasis on sexual renunciation in medieval religious life might have produced paradoxical effects. in some cases actually intensifying the very desires it sought to suppress. Medieval spiritual practices encouraged nuns to redirect their erotic energies toward Christ, conceptualized as the divine bridegroom. Mystical literature from female religious communities often employed intensely erotic imagery to describe the soul's union with God. Saint Teresa of Avila's famous description of mystical ecstasy, in which an angel pierced her heart with a golden spear, leaving her on fire with a great love of God, exemplifies this sublimation of erotic energy into spiritual experience. For some women, this spiritual redirection of sexuality proved effective and fulfilling. However, for others, particularly those who had entered convents without genuine religious vocation, the constant emphasis on renunciation combined with the absence of legitimate sexual outlets might have created significant psychological tension. The 13th century Dominican friar Thomas of Cantimpré reported cases of nuns experiencing what would now be recognized as hysteria or psychosomatic illness, which he attributed to their struggles with sexual temptation. The extreme focus on avoiding sexual thoughts and feelings might have created a psychological environment similar to what modern psychologists call ironic process theory, or the white bear problem, the phenomenon in which attempting to suppress thoughts about something actually increases their frequency and intensity. As the 12th century theologian Hugh of St. Victor observed, that which is forbidden becomes all the more desired. This psychological perspective helps explain why convents that emphasized extreme asceticism and constant vigilance against sexual thoughts did not necessarily produce fewer scandals than communities with more moderate approaches. The most effective communities in maintaining chastity appear to have been those that provided fulfilling alternative channels for emotional and physical energy through meaningful work, intellectual engagement, artistic expression, and genuine spiritual practice. The tension between religious ideals and social realities represents a fundamental framework for understanding sexual misconduct in medieval convents. The Church promoted an ideal of female monasticism based on genuine spiritual vocation, strict enclosure, and complete dedication to prayer and contemplation. The social reality, however, was that convents served multiple practical functions that often had little to do with these spiritual ideals. By the later Middle Ages, many convents functioned primarily as respectable residential institutions for unmarriageable daughters of the nobility. Women who for various reasons could not or would not marry, but required a socially acceptable living situation. Others served as educational institutions for girls who would eventually return to secular society. Still others functioned as retirement homes for widows or refuges for women fleeing difficult marriages. This gap between the spiritual ideal and social reality created inherent tensions within convent communities. Women who had entered religious life for practical rather than spiritual reasons might find the demands of perpetual celibacy particularly burdensome. Communities composed primarily of aristocratic women, accustomed to comfort and privilege, might resist the strict discipline and enclosure that the Church deemed essential for maintaining chastity. The clash between religious ideals and social realities became particularly acute during periods of economic hardship or institutional decline. When convents struggled financially, they often relaxed admission standards to accept any candidate who could provide a substantial dowry, regardless of spiritual vocation. Economic pressures also led some communities to reduce their level of enclosure to allow for income-generating activities, creating more opportunities for inappropriate contact with the outside world. Understanding this fundamental tension helps explain why reforms focused solely on stricter discipline and enclosure often failed to address the root causes of sexual misconduct. Only reforms that acknowledged and addressed the social realities of convent life, for example, by ensuring that women entered religious life voluntarily and with adequate preparation, or by providing meaningful activities beyond prayer, proved effective in reducing scandals over the long term. The families of medieval nuns played complex and sometimes contradictory roles in relation to convent sexuality. On one hand, noble families had strong incentives to ensure that their daughters maintained their chastity and the reputation of their religious communities, as scandals could damage family honor. On the other hand, the same families often contributed to conditions that made sexual misconduct more likely, either by placing unwilling daughters in convents or by insisting on privileges and comforts incompatible with strict monastic discipline. When scandals did occur, family responses varied widely depending on circumstances. In some cases, families vigorously defended their relatives against accusations of sexual misconduct, using their political and social influence to pressure ecclesiastical authorities to drop investigations or reduce penalties. A telling example comes from 14th century England, where the powerful Percy family successfully intervened when Agnes de Percy, prioress of Nunkeeling, was accused of having a child with a local chaplain. The bishop's investigation was abruptly terminated, and Agnes remained in her position. In other cases, families might disown daughters who had brought shame upon them through sexual scandals, refusing to receive them if they were expelled from their convents, and leaving them few options beyond prostitution or destitution. The Register of the Bishop of Lincoln records the case of Margaret Waver, a nun expelled from Elstow Abbey after becoming pregnant, whose family refused to receive her, forcing the bishop to arrange alternative accommodation. The influence of families extended beyond individual cases of misconduct to shape the overall environment of convent life. Powerful families often insisted that their daughters receive special privileges within convents, including private apartments, personal servants, and freedom to receive visitors. These privileges undermined the communal discipline and enclosure that the Church considered essential for maintaining chastity. As one 15th century visitation record noted, the nuns of noble birth keep their own apartments where they eat and sleep separately from the community and receive visitors without supervision. Bishops bore primary responsibility for overseeing female religious communities within their diocese, making them key figures in the prevention, detection, and punishment of sexual misconduct. The effectiveness of this oversight varied enormously depending on the diligence, moral character, and administrative capacity of individual bishops. Some bishops took their supervisory responsibilities seriously, conducting regular visitations, investigating reports of misconduct thoroughly, and implementing appropriate disciplinary measures when needed. The registers of bishops like Richard Fox of Winchester and William Alnwick of Lincoln contain detailed accounts of their visitations to convents, including careful investigations of rumored sexual misconduct and thoughtful remedial measures tailored to specific circumstances. Other bishops neglected their oversight duties, allowing years to pass between visitations and responding inadequately when problems were reported. Moreover, some bishops themselves became part of the problem. The historical record contains numerous cases of bishops who engaged in sexual relationships with nuns under their supervision, or who used their position to extract sexual favors. In 1282, Archbishop Peckham of Canterbury wrote to the Bishop of St. David's reprimanding him for his criminal familiarity with the nuns of Lanlair Priory. The effectiveness of episcopal oversight was further complicated by jurisdictional issues. Many convents belonged to exempt orders that were technically outside the bishop's authority, reporting directly to the Pope or to the leaders of their religious orders. These exemptions could create gaps in supervision, though popes occasionally appointed bishops as special visitors to exempt houses when serious problems were reported. Despite these limitations, episcopal visitations represented the most consistent mechanism for addressing sexual misconduct in medieval convents. The detailed records of these visitations, preserved in bishops' registers across Europe, provide our most valuable window into the day-to-day realities of convent life, including the challenges of maintaining the vow of chastity. As the ultimate authority within the Church, the papacy played an important role in addressing sexual misconduct in convents, particularly in cases that had escalated beyond the capacity of local authorities to resolve. Papal involvement typically took three forms: issuing general legislation governing female religious life, responding to appeals in specific cases, and commissioning special investigations when serious abuses were reported. The most significant papal legislation regarding female religious life came in 1298, when Pope Boniface VIII issued the decree Pericoloso, which mandated universal strict enclosure for all professed nuns. The decree began by acknowledging the dangerous and abominable situation of certain nuns who, casting off the reins of respectability and impudently throwing aside the modesty of their order and their sex, sometimes leave their cloisters and frequent the houses of secular persons. To prevent such behavior, Boniface ordered that nuns should remain perpetually enclosed within their convents, with strictly limited exceptions for inevitable necessities like fire or epidemic disease. Periculoso represented the most ambitious attempt to prevent sexual misconduct in convents through universal legislation. While it proved impossible to implement fully in practice, it established an ideal that would be repeatedly reinforced in subsequent centuries, culminating in the Council of Trent's similar provisions in the 16th century. In addition to general legislation, popes frequently became involved in specific cases of sexual misconduct, either through direct appeals or through their representatives. The papal penitentiary, the office responsible for matters of conscience and the granting of absolutions and dispensations, handled numerous cases involving nuns who had broken their vows of chastity. The penitentiary registers, which have only recently become available to researchers, contain records of hundreds of such cases, providing valuable insights into both the prevalence of sexual misconduct and the Church's responses. Finally, in cases of particularly serious or widespread abuses, popes sometimes commissioned special investigations that transcended normal jurisdictional boundaries. These extraordinary interventions typically occurred when scandals threatened the reputation of the Church as a whole, or when local authorities had proven unable or unwilling to address persistent problems. The papal investigation into the Gilbertine order following the Wotton scandal, described earlier, exemplifies this type of intervention. The prevalence and nature of sexual scandals in medieval convents varied significantly across different regions of Europe, reflecting broader cultural, social, and ecclesiastical patterns. While the historical record does not allow for precise statistical comparison, surviving visitation records and other sources suggest several notable regional patterns. Italian convents, particularly those in urban areas, appear to have experienced a higher incidence of sexual scandals compared to their northern European counterparts. This pattern likely reflects several factors: the greater integration of Italian convents into urban social life, the stronger tradition of aristocratic control over religious institutions in Italian cities, and the particular economic and social functions that convents served in Italian society. By the Renaissance period, many Italian convents had become essentially aristocratic enclaves with relatively weak religious discipline, creating conditions conducive to sexual misconduct. French convents show a more mixed pattern, with significant variation between different regions and religious orders. Royal foundations and houses affiliated with reform movements like the Cistercians generally maintained stricter discipline and experienced fewer scandals, while older Benedictine houses in regions with strong aristocratic influence more closely resembled the Italian pattern. The French Revolution eventually revealed the extent of these regional variations, as revolutionary authorities documented the moral state of convents during their suppression. English convents appear to have maintained relatively good discipline compared to their continental counterparts, though this impression may partly reflect the more limited surviving sources. English bishops' registers document occasional cases of sexual misconduct, but these appear less frequent and typically involve individuals rather than entire communities. The smaller size of English convents, their often rural locations, and the relatively strong tradition of episcopal oversight may have contributed to this pattern. Spanish convents present a distinctive pattern, with relatively few documented scandals during the medieval period, but increasing reports during the 16th and 17th centuries. This shift coincided with the Counter-Reformation's emphasis on stricter enclosure and discipline, which paradoxically may have increased tensions within convent communities by eliminating traditional outlets for social interaction. The famous cases of false mysticism and sexual misconduct, investigated by the Spanish Inquisition during this later period, suggest the complex psychological consequences of extreme emphasis on spiritual purity. The nature and frequency of sexual scandals in convents evolved significantly from the early medieval period through the Reformation era, reflecting broader changes in religious life, social structures, and cultural attitudes. While the historical record does not support simplistic narratives of either steady moral decline or progressive improvement, several important trends can be identified. The early medieval period, c. 500 to 1000, saw relatively few documented cases of sexual misconduct in convents, though this may partly reflect the limited surviving sources. Early medieval convents were typically small, elite institutions closely tied to royal or noble families, with genuine religious vocation as the primary motivation for entry. The most notorious scandals of this period, such as the rebellion at Sainte Croix described earlier, typically involved royal women placed in convents for political reasons rather than religious calling. The central medieval period, c. 1300, witnessed the expansion and institutionalization of female monasticism, with a corresponding increase in documented cases of sexual misconduct. This period saw the emergence of the classic pattern of the aristocratic convent, serving primarily social rather than spiritual functions, creating tensions between religious ideals and social realities. The Fourth Lateran Council's reform efforts in 1215 responded to the perception that discipline had declined in many religious communities during this period of rapid expansion. The late medieval period, c. 1300 to 1500, represents the peak of documented sexual scandals in convents, particularly in regions like Italy, where convents had become thoroughly integrated into aristocratic social networks. Economic hardship following the Black Death led many convents to accept candidates without genuine vocations, but with substantial dowries, while also forcing communities to reduce their level of enclosure to pursue income-generating activities. Visitation records from this period reveal recurring patterns of misconduct in certain communities despite repeated reform efforts. The Reformation era, c. 1500 to 1600, brought dramatic changes to female religious life. In Protestant regions, convents were dissolved entirely, with former nuns returning to secular life and often marrying. In Catholic regions, the Counter-Reformation instituted far-reaching reforms that transformed convent life, including stricter admission requirements, enhanced enclosure, and more rigorous supervision. These reforms appear to have reduced the incidence of sexual misconduct in the convents that survived into the early modern period, though at the cost of reducing their social functions and autonomy. Major historical events and trends significantly impacted the moral climate of medieval convents, creating conditions that either facilitated or discouraged sexual misconduct. Three particularly important influences were the expansion of urban economies, the devastation of the Black Death, and the religious upheavals of the Reformation era. The growth of urban economies and commercial culture from the 12th century onward transformed many convents, particularly in Italy and the Low Countries. Urban convents became increasingly integrated into city life, maintaining economic and social connections that made strict enclosure difficult to enforce. Moreover, the growing wealth of urban elites allowed them to place daughters in convents with substantial dowries and expectations of comfortable living conditions incompatible with strict monastic discipline. By the 14th century, many urban convents functioned essentially as aristocratic social clubs with religious trappings, creating environments where sexual discipline was difficult to maintain. The Black Death, 1347 to 1351, and subsequent plague outbreaks had complex effects on convent life. On one hand, the immediate aftermath of the plague often saw increased religious fervor and stricter observance in surviving communities. On the other hand, the long-term economic consequences forced many convents to accept unsuitable candidates who could provide needed income, while also requiring greater interaction with the outside world to manage diminished resources. Visitation records from the decades following the Black Death show increased reports of various disciplinary problems, including sexual misconduct, in previously well-ordered communities. The Protestant Reformation represented the most dramatic disruption to female religious life in the later medieval period. In regions that adopted Protestantism, convents were dissolved, with their inhabitants either returning to their families or receiving small pensions to support themselves. Many former nuns married, including Katharina von Bora, who became the wife of Martin Luther. In Catholic regions, the Counter-Reformation brought sweeping changes to convent life, with the Council of Trent mandating strict enclosure, careful screening of candidates, and enhanced episcopal supervision. These reforms effectively addressed many of the structural factors that had contributed to sexual misconduct in medieval convents, though at the cost of restricting the social functions and autonomy of female religious communities. The sexual scandals that periodically emerged from medieval convents represent only one aspect of a complex and multifaceted reality. While this examination has focused on instances of misconduct, it is important to recognize that such cases, though not rare, remained exceptions rather than the norm. The vast majority of medieval nuns lived lives of genuine piety and sincere commitment to their religious vows, finding meaningful purpose in prayer, service, and community. Medieval convents served multiple important functions beyond providing settings for religious devotion. They offered educational opportunities for girls and women in an era when formal education was largely restricted to males. They preserved and transmitted cultural knowledge through the copying of manuscripts and the teaching of music, art, and literature. they provided essential social services to their communities, including care for the sick, orphaned, and elderly. They offered spaces where women could exercise leadership, creativity, and intellectual engagement in ways often unavailable in secular society. Even convents that experienced disciplinary problems and sexual scandals typically maintained these positive functions alongside their challenges. The historical record suggests that rather than dividing convents into good and bad communities, we should recognize that most existed somewhere along a spectrum, with varying degrees of religious observance and discipline, coexisting with valuable social and cultural contributions. Moreover, the women who broke their vows of chastity were not simply moral failures, but complex individuals navigating difficult circumstances within the constraints of their time. Some had entered religious life against their will. Others had genuine vocations, but struggled with human desires. Still others found themselves in exploitative relationships with those who held power over them. Understanding their choices requires considering the limited options available to women in medieval society and the often impossible expectations placed upon them. The history of sexual scandals in medieval convents offers valuable insights for understanding the complex relationship between sexuality, institutional structures, and religious ideals that remains relevant today. Several key lessons emerge from this historical examination. First, attempts to suppress or deny human sexuality through institutional rules and practices often prove counterproductive, particularly when individuals have not freely chosen such restrictions. The medieval church's approach to sexuality within religious communities, emphasizing complete renunciation without providing adequate psychological preparation or support, created conditions where transgression became almost inevitable for some individuals. This pattern suggests that effective sexual ethics must acknowledge and work with human nature, rather than simply attempting to override it through rules and penalties. Second, the mismatch between institutional ideals and social realities creates fertile ground for hypocrisy and misconduct. Medieval convents officially existed for spiritual purposes, but in practice served numerous social, economic, and political functions that often contradicted their stated religious mission. This gap between theory and practice undermined the moral authority of the institutions and created conditions where rules might be followed in letter but violated in spirit. Similar dynamics can be observed in many contemporary institutions that maintain idealistic public images while operating according to very different practical realities. Third, gender and power dynamics profoundly shape expressions of sexuality within institutional contexts. The medieval church's patriarchal structure, which placed women under multiple layers of male authority, created conditions where sexual relationships often reflected or reinforced existing power imbalances. From relationships between nuns and their confessors, to the different treatment of male and female religious who violated identical vows, gender shaped every aspect of how sexuality was expressed, controlled, and judged within religious communities. These patterns remind us that sexuality never exists in a social vacuum, but always reflects broader structures of power and inequality. Finally, the history of medieval convent scandals demonstrates that genuine and lasting reform requires addressing root causes rather than simply imposing stricter discipline or punishment. Reforms that focused solely on enhancing physical enclosure or increasing penalties for misconduct generally proved ineffective. The most successful reforms were those that addressed the underlying issues, ensuring that women entered religious life voluntarily and with adequate preparation, providing meaningful activities beyond prayer, and creating healthy emotional environments within communities. This historical lesson remains relevant for any institution seeking to address misconduct within its ranks. The sexuality of nuns has fascinated Western culture for nearly a millennium, generating a vast body of literature, art, and popular culture that continues to the present day. From medieval fablio to Renaissance erotic literature to modern films and novels, the figure of the sexual nun has maintained a powerful grip on the cultural imagination. This enduring fascination merits reflection as we conclude our historical examination. At one level, this cultural obsession reflects simple prurience, the titillating appeal of forbidden sexuality and apparent hypocrisy. Yet the persistence and depth of this fascination suggests something more profound at work. The sexual nun represents a powerful cultural symbol that embodies fundamental tensions in Western attitudes toward sexuality, spirituality, and gender. The nun who breaks her vow of chastity symbolizes the tension between spiritual aspirations and bodily desires that has preoccupied Western thought since the early Christian era. Her transgression dramatically enacts the conflict between flesh and spirit that all humans navigate in various ways. As the medieval theologian Peter Abelard wrote, "In the nun who sins carnally, we see most clearly the battle between flesh and spirit that rages in every human heart." Moreover, the sexual nun challenges fundamental cultural assumptions about female sexuality and autonomy. In a culture that has historically defined women primarily through their sexual relationships with men, as virgins, wives, or prostitutes, the nun represents a provocative alternative. Her sexuality exists outside the normal structures of male control through marriage or commercial transaction. Whether portrayed as victim or agent, the nun who expresses sexuality outside these structures disrupts conventional categories and suggests possibilities of female desire independent of male definition. Finally, the enduring fascination with nun sexuality reflects a broader cultural ambivalence about the relationship between sexuality and spirituality. The medieval church attempted to separate these domains completely, exalting virginity while treating sexuality as inherently sinful outside very narrow constraints. Yet the persistent reality of sexual desire within ostensibly spiritual communities suggests the artificiality of this separation. The scandals of medieval convents remind us that sexuality and spirituality are both fundamental aspects of human experience that cannot be fully separated or opposed without creating damaging contradictions. In examining the carnal scandals of medieval nuns with historical accuracy and human empathy, we gain insight not only into a fascinating aspect of the medieval past, but also into the continuing challenges of integrating sexuality, spirituality, and institutional structures in ways that honor the full humanity of all involved. The nuns who struggled with these challenges centuries ago were neither the saintly stereotypes of official hagiography nor the lustful caricatures of satirical literature. They were complex human beings navigating difficult tensions within the constraints of their time, a reality that invites our understanding rather than our judgment across the centuries that separate us.